Well, good afternoon again, brethren. And it's a delight to hear all of you sing and to sing all of your faces and be able to get together once again here on the Sabbath. I usually read through the Reader's Digest most every month, and I've gotten used to doing that over many years and many decades. And I thought there was an article in there that might have some significance. Actually, I've seen in that publication, more and more wrong thinking being just kind of subtly interjected. And yet one of the articles was, something you shouldn't forget, something you should remember, the Sabbath. And I thought, great! But then, of course, I found out they were talking about Sunday. I found out that that's what they were promoting. They were promoting a day of rest. And they even quoted Exodus 20, remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. And they immediately followed that by saying, but we're not told anywhere which day is the Sabbath. And of course, it was about some older lady who always kept Sunday or who always rested on a given day. That's the type of thing, that we run into. And I don't know how it is around your place. Of course, where we live in town, there are all kinds of political signs that have been littered all over the streets everywhere. That's a couple of weeks ago, because most everything after a couple of days, you started to see most of those signs disappear. And actually, I'm very happy that I don't have to look at all. I mean, who some of the major people would be, some of the names, and you can kind of tell who's supporting who as far as the parties. And then just a day or two before Election Day, I saw more signs than you would ever imagine. And they had names on there I had never heard of. I assume, more local, more, all different types of selection that needed to be made. And yet, like I say, today, most of those are gone. Most of them are gone, and people are adjusting to not knowing the answer as far as exactly what's going to be right or what's going to be occurring. But I do have some consistent signs that are still up. And I'm going to say that I think these are being either promoted by a local church or a general church in the Johnson County area. One of them says, love is kind. Now, that's surely a good thing to put up in your yard. I mean, to remember or to remind people that love is kind. Now, I'm pretty sure that is connected to some kind of a church group. Another one says, and looks pretty similar, so probably from the same group, love your neighbor. And again, there's certainly nothing wrong with those signs. Implication might not be exactly what you might think, because they may have different ideas. But I want to go over a parable that I know all of you are aware of in Luke chapter 10. A parable that only Luke records. Matthew and Mark do not, and John does not record, I believe, any parables. There could be some very short statements in John, but mostly he's not dealing with parables. And in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you often see similar ones, and that all come together. But in Luke chapter 10, and I'm not going to be turning there right yet, but in Luke chapter 10, I want to go over the parable that I've entitled The Parable of the Neighbor. Now, that may not be the heading that your Bible gives that parable, but I would say that it would be correct. It would be correct to say, as we study this, that that's a good title. the neighbor. The kind and compassionate neighbor. Now, first of all, I think all of us know that Jesus tells us that we're to love other people. We're to love God and love other people. We certainly are to love the brethren. And many times that's fairly easy because they tend to love us back. There tends to be a reciprocal arrangement there because we're all having a similar understanding. We're striving to honor God, and we're striving to do what God says. And so loving the brethren clearly is something we ought to be doing. And we're told to love one another. And Jesus directly said that to the disciples as he was about to be put to death. You're going to need to stick together here. You're going to need to love one another. And actually, that's going to be a way God can identify, or even other people can identify you, that you do love one another. And of course, Jesus makes it even harder when he says, love your enemies. He was able to do that with him living in us. We can do that too. It just seems to be considerably harder. We have to focus a little more. We have to really try to figure out how we can view things in a way, even if someone is what we would term an enemy. And again, maybe we don't identify a lot of enemies in our lives, but we surely can identify those who would not agree with us. And so we're still told to love our enemy. And then, finally, I come to the parable of the neighbor. The neighbor. And I want to go over that. I want to begin, though, in Matthew 22, because in Matthew 22, you also have a summary. You have a summary of what Jesus said. And of course, Jesus was incredibly wise. He knew what was going on with all of the people he interacted with. He had a great deal of love for all of them. He healed many out of love, out of kindness, out of being an individual that really had the right care for others. And you also see that he was able to, in a sense, address the questions that were brought to him by the religious establishment. And in many ways you would find that ultimately they would become his enemies. They would become those who would eventually want him to be crucified. And so for him to get something on the Sadducees, the Pharisees kind of like that. And vice versa. If he got something on the Pharisees, I'm sure the Sadducees like that. And of course they always had an argument over the resurrection and how that was going to be or what was going to happen. But in verse 34 here, it says the Pharisees heard that he had silenced the Sadducees, so that would indicate to me they were happy to see that. And they gathered together, and one of them, a lawyer, asked Jesus a question, again not trying to learn anything, but just to test him. And he said, "Teacher, which commandment is in the law is the greatest?" And of course he correctly answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. And the second is like unto it, you shall love your neighbor. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. And on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets." So we know that's a summary of the Ten Commandments. The first four primarily directed toward loving God. Loving God the way God tells us to love Him. Understanding what He wants. Understanding how He wants us to approach Him. How He wants us to obey Him. How He has created the Sabbath. And He actually designates which day it is. And see, we all know Jesus knew which day it was only 2,000 years ago. And so everybody should know that the Sabbath is the seventh day of the week. But see, most people don't want to agree. Apparently, the calendar is not enough. Because when you even look on any calendar, you can see day 1 through 7 on that calendar, as it is listed at least, on most, although don't go to Germany. They got that mixed up over there. They confuse it a little bit. But, this tells us to love God in the way He says and love our neighbor, which goes beyond our brother or even our enemy. It goes to what we want to read here in Luke chapter 10. So we'll go to Luke chapter 10 now, the parable of the neighbor. Because in essence, that's what Jesus is going to teach. Luke chapter 10, this is a parable that most people are very familiar with. There are many, perhaps, sermons that would be preached out of Luke chapter 10. There are many paintings that would indicate, what happens in this parable. Actually, a lot of many different depictions of this parable. And, of course, usually it's going to be called the parable of the Good Samaritan, as probably your heading in the Bible tells you. But see, I'm pointing this out because what Jesus really taught was who was your neighbor. Who was your neighbor? And so we've already read a verse in Matthew and a verse in Luke that says we're supposed to love our neighbor. Here in verse 25, a lawyer stood up to Jesus and said, "Teacher, what do I have to do to inherit eternal life?" And so that was the first question. What do I have to do to inherit eternal life? And he said, again, always answering with correct information. And he really just framed this in, can't you read? What's written in the law? He says, verse 27, he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, with all your strength." So it even goes beyond the heart, soul, and mind, but all your strength. Love your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And so this particular teacher, or Pharisee, I guess, or lawyer, who was quoting this out of Deuteronomy 6, he could tell what the law did say. He quoted Deuteronomy 6, verse 5, and he quoted Leviticus 19, verse 18. Those were well known. And of course, Jesus told him, "You're right. You've given the right answer, so all you have to do is do it. Love God, but also love your neighbor." Love your neighbor. And so in verse 29, this lawyer, it says, wanted to justify himself. He found that, he asked a question. Jesus told him that he was right in his understanding. But then he really didn't want to accept that answer. And so he didn't want to learn anything. He didn't want to know what it was that Jesus would tell him. He just wanted to create an argument, create some confusion. And so he asked another question. He changes the question in verse 29. Wanting to justify himself, he asked Jesus, "But who is your neighbor?" If you're supposed to love your neighbor, he probably thought, I've surely been doing that to at least some degree. But he asked the question in verse 29, who is your neighbor? And so Jesus gives this parable in verse 30. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among a band of robbers. He fell among thieves. This particular stretch of about 20 miles from Jerusalem down to Jericho was a hilly area. It was easy to hide, I guess. Bandits wanted to try to ambush someone. That's an easy place to do it. Wait for someone to be by themselves. And so he said, a man was going from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among thieves. They stripped him, they beat him, they left him half dead. And so a mugging, a theft occurring. And it says in verse 31, by chance a priest a priest. Actually, this highway, I guess you could say, road that kind of goes through and down from Jerusalem because it's going down to a lower elevation in Jericho. It was called the Way of Blood because it was it was like walking into a notoriously bad neighborhood and knowing that you might not come out with your tires all inflated, knowing that you might be mugged in a bad area. So in verse 31, it says, by chance a priest was going down the road, and when this priest saw him, he passed by on the other side. And so here we have a situation that Jesus again is framing. Here he described one of the priests, one of the religious elite in Israel. And you might think, well, maybe he had a reason why. Maybe he didn't want to get his robe bloody. Maybe he didn't want to be defiled. He's supposed to be there, so he didn't want to be defiled with a dead body. There could have been, I don't think that there's any real other explanations here because Jesus is going to explain what he wants all of us to know. But we find that this priest certainly didn't offer any aid. He didn't seem to really care. And maybe he even thought, maybe I'm too important to do this. Maybe I'm not designated to do that. So you see the first character described here in verse 31 and verse 32. Likewise, a Levite, when he came to the place, he saw him too. He also passed by on the other side. Maybe he studied it a little more. Maybe he began to look around and think, well, this looks like a good place to get robbed myself. Anyway, he again didn't show any concern. He passed by on the other side. He didn't help the injured man, the man who apparently was half dead. And then finally in verse 33, a Samaritan, while traveling, came near him. Now the Samaritans were not viewed favorably by the people of Judah. They were actually viewed in a very, very angry, as an enemy, as a defiled people or a Gentile nation, mostly Gentile as opposed to Jewish. And however, Jesus frames this correctly by saying, well, this Samaritan, and he could have said, whom you all hate, but he didn't say that. You see that in John chapter 4, verse 9. It says that the Samaritans were despised by the Jews. And so, again, Jesus was setting this up correctly. They had been brought into Samaria after the captivity of Israel, and so, they were not a part of Israel per se. And in Luke 9, you also can read in verse 51 to verse 56 that they didn't have dealings with the Jews. So, there was an obvious bias here, obvious, in a sense, despising. I guess we mentioned that last time about not despising other people. But here, the Samaritan, verse 33, while traveling came near him, and when he saw him, he was moved with compassion. He was moved with pity. He went to the man, he bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them, and then he put him on his own animal and brought him to an inn and took care of him. The next day he took out some money, gave them to the innkeeper, said, take care of him, and when I come back, I'm going to repay you for anything else that you need to spend. So he gave him a certain amount of money, said, if that takes care of it, fine. If not, when I come back through here, I'll pay for the rest. Now, Jesus' question is listed here in verse 36. Which of these three do you think was a neighbor? Because, see, the question the lawyer had posed was, who is my neighbor? The question, Jesus answers by asking them, well, which of these three do you think was the neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? And of course, even this lawyer could say, well, the one who showed him mercy, the one who had compassion upon him, the one who went out of his way to try to help him. And so whenever Jesus says, love your neighbor, he says, you need to understand who I'm talking about when I talk about your neighbor. And so in verse 37, you see Jesus concluding this after the lawyer answered, the one who showed him mercy, and Jesus said, well, you should go and do likewise. Now again, all of you, I know, are familiar with the parable. But I'd like for us to simply think about, what was Jesus saying about who we are to love? What was he saying about who it is that is our neighbor? Because there are several lessons that we can maybe take away from this parable. Some of them are quite obvious. Obviously, the one who had mercy, the one who had compassion, the one who carried this injured person to help, the one who, it didn't matter that he was a Samaritan, it mattered that he was a human being. And he had concern for this other human being. So what lessons can we learn from this parable? First of all, again, I said this is only recorded in Luke, and you might wonder why that is the case. I'm not really sure that I know for sure why that would be the case. Luke was a doctor. He was a physician. He often wrote about the people who were in need. He wrote about women more than any other group or any other writer about how women were treated or mistreated. He wrote about children. He also wrote about medical stuff more than any of the others. And so maybe that's the reason why this particular parable was recorded. Luke was also gathering information from other people. And maybe Matthew and Mark really didn't even have that information available. I don't know. But the first thing that we can state as far as a lesson is just simply who is our neighbor. And the answer to that would be our neighbor is one in need whom we can help. Our neighbor is one who needs assistance, who needs help, that we have the capacity to do that. Now, sometimes we don't really have the capacity to do it. We're unable to do it. It's not smart in many ways to stop along a busy highway and try to help a situation that maybe is already getting help. That's not what it's talking. What we learn is who is our neighbor, one who is in need that we can help. And see, this is not simply, sometimes whenever you read this and you think, who's my neighbor? And I immediately think of, my immediate neighbors. I have two different families that live across the street from me, and I know their name. I don't know very much else about them. I do interact with them at times, just trying to get the leaves out of the yard or trying to mow the grass. And I know who they are. They know who I am. I know the lady who lived in one of the houses got married. So there's a husband there now. So there's two instead of one. I also know the other man over there. He has several cars. He apparently loves cars because he keeps those cars very nicely and he covers them very nicely. And I've seen him drive up and down in a copper Ram, I believe it is. I mean, it's a unique looking pickup. I don't know a whole lot about them more. I know his wife's there. I know he has children, look like older children come and go, but I don't know much about them. I also have neighbors on both sides of me, one on the right, one on the left, the sheep and the goats. No. They're both neither goats, really. I mean, they are wonderful. They probably wish I was as good a neighbor as they really are, because Dwayne, just to the west of me, I know he's a preacher of some kind. He's a reverend. At least I've gotten that on some of his mail at times. And he is the most optimistic, positive. He just retired. And I'm not exactly sure all the details, but now I see him in the yard a lot more. He keeps everything really neat. He and his wife are very, very nice to talk to, and they have a daughter who comes and brings, her husband and a couple of little kids occasionally. They live reasonably close. And so I know quite a bit more, and I know his father-in-law and mother-in-law lived there with them until his mother-in-law died. His father-in-law has now moved to an assisted living, and so he is being cared for in another way. He claims that he's a captive over there because they don't let him leave anymore. But see, I know quite a bit more about Dwayne because he's right next door, and he's really a nice person. He's always optimistic. He knows that I never cut the lawn on the Sabbath. He always does. He always cuts the lawn. I even had an interaction with his father-in-law, who also he's a FBI chaplain. And he told me, well, you're mowing that lawn on our Sabbath. So I was doing it on Sunday. And I said, yeah, I know. I know I'm mowing the lawn on your Sabbath, but I observe God's Sabbath. Didn't talk to him much after that. But he knew, I mean, he actually came over and prayed for me when I was very sick. I thought, well, that's okay. I can handle that. And he and his wife both came. And I think the first time we'd ever really discussed anything with them about, and we anticipated that we would get better, or that I would get better. And so I was saying about Dwayne being so optimistic. He's always, every time we have some people that live across the creek in the back, or the watershed, or whatever it is, water runs through there at times. And there are people who line the other side of the creek, and there was some loud noise coming. And I said, Dwayne, is that your music? And he said, no, that's the neighbors across the street. He pointed out who it is. I said, well, I think they need to make better selections or something. And then he said, well, at least it's free. So he always is optimistic. I'm out, maybe I mentioned this, trying to move leaves. And he tells me, well, it'll be back, but at least that's job security. You've got some good security doing that. So I know more about Dwayne than probably any. He's been there longer. And then on the other side, Dave and Sue live there, and he's wonderful. He has the best lawn everywhere. It is amazingly good. He works in it all the time. He loves to do it. He is retired, although has to be very young to be retired, but his wife is still working. And we often interact with them, and I know he grows a nice garden in the back. He's got all kinds of stuff, or he or she does, have things in the garden. Dave is always very nice. Whenever we're going to the feast, he comes over, mows things down, picks up the leaves. And one time we were, what was it? I usually can see their cars and know whether they're even there or not, because he has two cars that he puts in the garage and then one that he sits out just in his driveway. And whenever all the cars are gone, or whenever the car outside is gone, you figure he's probably gone in it. But then I saw that one of the two garage doors was open. And it was still open later on. And it was still open toward night. And so I got to thinking, well, I wonder, if they are saying anything's wrong. I wonder if, if one of them was there and had some kind of injury, or I couldn't figure it out. So I did go over and start looking in, and the radio was blaring in the garage. And I'm thinking, well, and I'd ring the doorbell and knock on the door. Finally, I don't get any response, and I don't even know if I want to go in here and try to even see if anybody is hurt. But I did go into the door through the garage and yelled several times. Nobody answered. It appeared to me no one was here. So I don't think anyone's injured, or at least I don't see anybody from the door that looked like he was injured. And then I ended up giving him a call. And the cell phone, the number I have for him, it is one that I think his wife normally carries. And when I got a hold of him, I said, Dave, or Susan, is everything all right? And she said, yeah, we're in Nebraska. And I said, okay, well, I'm just telling you, this is Joe next door, I'm just telling you, I went into your house because your garage door is up. Oh, no! And so we'll call one of our kids and I told him, well, I've already walked through, shut the garage door, come out the front door, locked it back. It's locked now, but I just wanted you to know. And so, you know a little more about some than the others, but see, Jesus is not talking about that. He's not talking about the people who are very close to you that you would surely, if you saw anything wrong with them, you would try to help them. He's talking about a neighbor where he puts no restriction on who to help or who to serve. He just really doesn't. And of course, no restriction on race. He framed that right with the Samaritan. Samaritan not really connected to the Jews, and yet no restriction on race, nationality, religion. Now, we could have difference of opinion, yes, but should we refuse to help? We're actually told in Romans 12:13, Christians are to show hospitality, which would be love to strangers or to people that we may come across who could need help, again, in an appropriate setting. So our neighbor is anyone in need whom we might have the ability to help. Now, I would also say that me trying to fix somebody's car would not be a help. Because I don't know enough about it and I don't have any tools or equipment and don't, it would be, if I can't blow the tire back up with a pump, then I'm out of luck. So the first thing that we have to realize is just simply that Jesus says that our neighbor is another human being that we can actually help, who is in need that we could help. The second thing I'll mention about what this Samaritan did, what this neighbor did, was he went out of his way to help this man who had been robbed and who had been beaten, who had been mugged, and who was clearly, in need. We're told in 1 John 3, verse 16 through 18, that we're to love not in just simply our words, but in our deeds. And we can have love for others, and yet we also need to be willing to go out of our way. And of course, love in action is what this is talking about. James 1:22 says it's not just the hearers of the word, but doers of the word. So it's not enough for me to simply think, well, I should love my neighbor. If I can, I should try to help that neighbor. And certainly if they are in need, I need to try to do that. And James 1:27 says religion that is undefiled will care for those who are in need. Care for the fatherless and the widow. That's what James 1:27 says. And so again, that's talking about neighbors. So what Jesus said that was you need to practice what you preach. You need to know not just what it says, like we do know, but we need to be willing to put that in action. And actually you find that compassion really should be based on need and not just maybe even who someone is or what influence might they have. We see this in Luke 6. Let's back up a couple of pages, because in Luke 6, in verse 32, you see another example. Of course, Jesus here is talking about, kind of listing what we normally know in the Matthew 5, 6, and 7 as the Sermon on the Mount. He says that we should love our enemies in verse 27. But what I want to focus on is down in verse 32. If you love those who love you, see, that would be the brethren, or that would be people even that you're somewhat friendly with. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Or even sinners love those who love them. And so that's what he describes as, well, that's what any, kind of somewhat concerned neighbor or friend would do. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those. Verse 33, if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. In verse 34, if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that? Even sinners do that. They lend to other sinners to receive as much again. See, he points out, Jesus in this remarkable parable that is only found in Luke 10 about the neighbor. The neighbor that Jesus describes as we should become. Compassion that we extend to others should be based on their need, not whether they can return something, whether they could repay us, whether they could maybe return our effort. And the final thing, the third thing, it's obvious from what Jesus said, is that truly loving our neighbor may require some sacrifice on our part. See, that was clearly what this Samaritan did. He was not only willing to be concerned, he was willing to give of his time. He took his own animal and took the man to an inn. He paid for his stay, said, I'll help out more if it becomes necessary. That's what we read here in chapter 10 of Luke. In verse 35, he says, the next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, said, take care of him. When I come back, I'll repay you whatever you spend. And so, if we're going to love our neighbor, and that's, of course, what the sign said in several different yards around where I live, if we're going to love our neighbor, then we're going to need to understand what that means. And understand even the direction that Jesus was giving in this parable. Jesus also tells us in Matthew 5 that our righteousness, in verse 20, our righteousness is going to need to exceed that of the scribes and the Pharisees. Actually, you could say the priest and the Levite did pretty much what the scribes and Pharisees were used to doing. Kind of not being too concerned about those that maybe couldn't influence them or help them. This is what we're told to do. But with the love of God in us, see, we can follow the example of this kind and compassionate Samaritan. And then, again, as Jesus says here in verse 37, if we want, and really, what was the original question? And so what was Jesus actually answering? The original question was, what do I have to do to have eternal life? That was the question that was posed, and ultimately he answered that, by loving your neighbor and understanding who your neighbor is. So in order to enter into life, we need to do the same thing that it says here in verse 37. Jesus said to him, go and do likewise. If you want to enter into life, you can. You can, with Christ living in you, go and do likewise. And so I I point this out simply because, the summary that he gives in Matthew 22 of love your neighbor, and of course is reiterated here in Luke 10, the summary, seems to imply all of the, the last 6 commands. And of course, they all do have to do with loving other people, serving other people. And yet, the way Jesus describes it is truly understanding who your neighbor is and how it is that if that person is in need and we can help them, that we would go about our Christian duty in order to do that. So all of us hopefully can, even in our distress as we go forward here, we are going to need to do what Jesus said, go and do likewise.